The dividing line between military force and economic warfare has been very blurry. Throughout history, you had to win a naval battle in order to impose really significant economic pain on a foreign country. Now, Donald Trump can sit in the Oval Office, sign a document, and impose devastating economic harm on any country around the world. So if you think about it just from the perspective of almost like moral hazard, the threshold for the use of economic warfare has gone significantly down, whereas the impact has gone significantly up.
Why does that matter in terms of choke points?
Miscalculation is in some ways the biggest risk because we don't know exactly where that escalatory spiral could lead.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Political Capital. Today we'll be talking with Edward Fishman about his new book, Chokepoints. Chokepoints is a history of modern economic warfare, focusing on the growing use of what Eddie calls the economic arsenal of the United States, like sanctions, export controls, and increasingly tariffs. We'll be exploring what lessons we might take away for the early stage technology sector about economic warfare, especially at a moment where economic conflict between the US and China is escalating so quickly. My name is Nate Loewentheil. I'm the founder and managing partner of Commonweal Ventures and the host of Political Capital. Political Capital is a conversation series exploring the intersection of technology, policy, and finance. We are joined today by Edward, or Eddie Fishman. Eddie is a newly minted New York Times bestselling author. Congrats, by the way.
Thank you.
An international relations scholar, a former diplomat, who's currently a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy and an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University. He's also most notably an advisor at Commonweal Ventures. From 2015 to 2017, Eddie served at the U.S. Department of State as a member of the Secretary's policy planning staff. In that role, Eddie advised Secretary of State John Kerry on Europe and Eurasia and led the staff's work on economic sanctions, long-range strategic planning, and international order and norms. And we'll hear a little bit more about Eddie's experience in just a couple minutes. Eddie has also worked at the Pentagon and at the U.S. Treasury. I think it is fair to say is one of the world's leading experts on economic warfare. Eddie, thank you so much for being here with us.
It's an honor, Nate. I'm excited to be on the show today.
So let's start with the name of your book, this concept of choke points. You open with this compelling example of a physical choke point, the Bosphorus Strait separating the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which for me made immediately, right off the bat, made the whole thing so much more concrete and visceral, which I assume was kind of the point. Walk us through the importance of that actual choke point in the history of economic warfare, and then the analogy you draw with the modern version of choke points that are no longer just geopolitical physical straits, but swift banking system, the JP Morgans of the world.
Sure. Yeah. So throughout history, choke points, really maritime choke points or other physical geographic choke points, have played an important role both in global trade and in geopolitics. The Bosphorus, as you said, is this narrow strait. Anyone who's ever been to Istanbul, you've seen it. It cuts right through the city. It's actually the boundary between Europe and Asia. It connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara and the Mediterranean. And it's been so important throughout history because the Black Sea region has always been a big source of natural resources. Actually, in college, I studied ancient history. And in ancient Greece, the Athenian Empire actually fed itself from grain from what is now Ukraine. The Ukrainian coastline is the northern part of the Black Sea. And so Ukraine, the grain fields of Ukraine, Athenian ships would pick up that grain, sail through the Bosphorus and onward to Athens, which was, a journey that could take, several days at the time. Today, even the Bosphorus is still an important choke point. You have something like 3 million barrels of oil every single day that goes through that choke point coming from places like Russia and Kazakhstan. You still have a massive amount of grain coming from places like Russia and Ukraine that go through that choke point. And so really throughout history, controlling the Bosphorus has been extremely strategically important. So I mentioned Athens. Actually, the reason that Athens fell and lost the Peloponnesian War was because Sparta defeated Athens in a naval battle and seized control of the Bosphorus.
Cut them off from critical supplies.
Exactly. Basically starved the Athenian Empire into submission. The Ottoman Empire rose really because of their control of the Bosphorus, and it was their conquest of what was then Constantinople, eventually became Istanbul, which became so important to the rise of that entire civilization. So the Bosphorus today is still important. There are other choke points that are important. Some people have probably heard of the Strait of Hormuz, where you've got 20% of global oil supplies going through every single day. So that's probably the most important for the energy trade. The Suez Canal, extremely important. And really, this concept is important because it shows how economics and geopolitics have collided. Because oftentimes controlling these choke points has required military force to actually seize them. But then using that control and being able to shut off others' access to it has been strategically very significant.
Part of the book, obviously, is to draw from that historic analogy in the Peloponnesian War and the rise of the Ottoman Empire, but to also demonstrate these more contemporary versions of choke points. And so you cover the evolution of this sort of modern arsenal. So what are some of the examples of those modern economic choke points?
Sure. So yeah, maybe just to carry the analogy forward too. I mean, if you think about it, ultimately the reason the Spartans were able to defeat the Athenians and the reason that them seizing control of the Bosphorus was so important was because ultimately they could cut off the flow of grain to Athens, right? So it was an act of military warfare, winning a naval battle, that then allowed them to wage economic warfare on Athens that won that contest with the Athenians, right? And so oftentimes throughout history, really the dividing line between military force and economic warfare has been very blurry. Even in the 1990s, when the UN had an oil embargo on Saddam Hussein's Iraq and tried to stop Iraq from selling oil on global markets, that was actually implemented by naval patrol. So a US and multinational naval force patrolling the Persian Gulf 24/7 from 1990 all the way up to 2003. The thing that has made economic warfare today so novel, and why I believe we're living in an age of economic warfare that really began in the early part of the 21st century, is that we now have these economic invisible choke points, like the dollar-based financial system, not only messaging platforms like SWIFT, but settlement platforms like CHIPS, the clearinghouse interbank payment system, and also just the markets that are largely denominated in dollars and that are based in US jurisdiction. You have the semiconductor supply chain, where even though a lot of the fabrication is done in places like Taiwan and countries like South Korea, 40% of the entire value chain is produced by US companies like NVIDIA, Applied Materials, Micron, which means that the US government has tremendous power to cut other countries off of that value chain. And so the way I would think about it, if you want a quick shorthand, I mean, the US is something like 25% of global GDP, 10% of global trade. But if you look at certain specific areas of the global economy, like the financial system, 90% of all foreign exchange transactions have the dollar on one side of it. 60% of central bank reserves are in dollars. So significantly higher than our share of global economic output or trade. Same with the semiconductor value chain, which I mentioned is 40% is US share.
So let's put aside the technology stuff for a second. I want to come back to that, but I just want to further articulate this idea about these choke points that used to be physical and now are primarily digital, and the connection between that and the dominant role that the dollar plays in the global economy. So, and you had some very powerful statistics in the book about, as you said, 90% of trade is conducted in U.S. dollars. Why does that matter in terms of choke points? How does the U.S. kind of weaponize the global reliance on the dollar to control, or impose sanctions on folks?
Yeah. So you asked about the economic arsenal. So sanctions, I think, are the most important and most relevant for the conversation today. Maybe it's helpful just to explain what a sanction is, right? So if the United States were to impose sanctions on Sberbank, which is the largest bank in Russia, which in fact the United States did in March of 2022, what that means is that Sberbank is fully cut off from the US financial system. So if Sberbank were to have any assets in US jurisdiction, that would mean that they were in US bank accounts or on US exchanges. Those US companies, either the bank or the exchange, would be required to freeze those assets. They would not be allowed to transfer them. And were they to unfreeze them or to transfer them, they would be violating US law. And so they could be fined significant amounts of money by the US government or potentially even lose their banking license. So it could be a death sentence for banks, right? In addition to an asset freeze, there's also a transaction ban. So a critical part here is, in addition to being the world's preeminent store of value, the dollar is also the world's preeminent medium of exchange. And so even when two different countries that have nothing to do with the US are trading with each other, and I used an example of Saudi Arabia selling oil to India or India selling rice to Saudi Arabia, they're going to be ultimately using the dollar to clear that transaction. Because if you think about it, it wouldn't make sense for banks around the world to hold every single currency that they might encounter. So what banks tend to do is they hold their local currency. So in the case of a Saudi bank, they'll hold Saudi riyals, but then they also hold the dollar. The dollar is basically a way station that can be used when they're transacting with anyone else. So even when it comes to China, and I'm sure we'll get more into this over the course of our conversation, China is the world's biggest exporter by far. They're the leading trading partner of 2/3 of the world's countries. And yet only 30% of China's own trade is settled in RMB. 70% is settled in dollars. So even with China, banks around the world aren't holding enough RMB to actually settle the trade with China in RMB.
And you make the point in the book that, so when people are settling trade, that they're actually sending dollars back and forth to each other through these banks. And that creates a kind of potential choke point for the US, because if you're using JP Morgan or Citi to sort of settle your trades, and the US says, thou shalt not trade, JP Morgan do not allow this trade, the trade stops.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So there's to get a little more technical, it's called correspondent banking, where most banks will have a relationship with a correspondent bank in New York. Could be JP Morgan Chase, could be Citi, in which that bank would serve as a way station for their dollar transactions. So, in the case of India selling rice to Saudi Arabia, the Saudi bank may take riyals, transfer it to their correspondent to be exchanged to dollars. Then the dollars would be exchanged to rupees, and then the rupees would be paid to the Indian, farming company, right? But ultimately, there would be that choke point, basically that JP Morgan, that correspondent in that chain that must comply with US law. And so that gives the United States government tremendous power just with the stroke of a pen. I think this is what's critical. I mentioned throughout history, you had to win a naval battle in order to impose really significant economic pain on a foreign country. Now, Donald Trump can sit in the Oval Office, sign a document, and impose devastating economic harm on any country around the world. So if you think about it just from the perspective of almost like moral hazard, the threshold for the use of economic warfare has gone significantly down, whereas the impact has gone significantly up as the global economy has integrated and we've moved into this dollarized world.
I mean, it's interesting you're framing there. I mean, do you think it makes policymakers more willing to take steps that are actually pretty dramatic because they don't seem as dramatic? Because, we're not hurting anyone. We're just cutting off the flow of money. It's like, well, actually, that's pretty important.
Yes. Yeah. Simply. Yeah. 100%. I mean, I've been in roles in government where I was imposing sanctions on foreign companies myself, and I think that as you may be able to attest to as well, working in government, there are very few roles in government where you're actually doing things, right? Where you're actually like making something happen in the economy. And so it can be pretty tantalizing, especially when you're dealing with intractable national security and foreign policy problems, when you say, wow, we can literally sign a document and impose really significant harm on this foreign country, this foreign leader. And it's appealing. And I mentioned Trump being able to do it. A lot of those powers are even devolved to agencies, right? So the State Department or the Treasury Department, it's officials who are, not even, elected officials who are wielding this power.
Right. And it might not get the kind of headlines or have the visceral impact of, sending troops into battle, but it's still a pretty powerful tool. One point you make in the book, which I love, and you really place in this historic context, it's only because of the remarkable sophistication and sort of interdependence of the global economy that these kinds of tools become possible. And in fact, it's only really in the last maybe 25 years that the US could have wielded these kinds of economic weapons.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that a critical precursor to the age of economic warfare, in sort of an ironic turn, is this period of hyperglobalization that happens in the 90s, right? Because after World War II, you get economic interdependence that really develops amongst America and other advanced industrial democracies. But it's not until the 90s when Russia, the former Soviet Union, China come into the global economic order. They come into global supply chains, and critically, they come into the international financial system. And it's also not even really until the 1970s, 1980s, where you get the deregulation of finance such that you could have a financialized global economy. Right. So really, it's not until the 90s that this becomes possible. And I think a really important point, and one that I think we forget at our own peril, is that countries opted into this system, right? It wasn't like the US forced them to use the dollar. They decided that it was in their interest. It would be good for their economic growth. It would be good for their political development. And I think that what's happened in the last several decades, and part of the macro narrative of my book, Chokepoints, is that countries now have woken up to the fact that in addition to providing them with some level of economic prosperity, it also makes them vulnerable to be this exposed to the United States.
Yeah, and there's sort of a deep irony that you lay out in the book of both that people have opted into a system that gives the U.S. power, but also that the more that the U.S. abuses that power, not abuse, but uses that power, the more that countries realize, well, wait, I'm not sure I want this dependence, and it may actually reduce the efficacy, of our economic arsenal over time.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think that, there have been some people, including many I respect, like former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, who've argued that we just need to use sanctions less, that we're overusing economic weapons. My own view is that it's one of those things that sounds good in theory, but is not that useful, because I do believe we are living in an age of economic warfare. We're seeing it now. It's not just the US using these tools. It's China, it's Europe, it's Japan, it's Russia. So were the US to stop using sanctions or tariffs and export controls, be sort of tantamount to unilateral disarmament. So I don't think that that's very likely. And I think maybe a critical point for listeners here is that there's actually been this exponential increase in the use of sanctions between every president in the 21st century. So from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden and now to Trump again, we've seen literally it double with each presidency. And so to me, that points to an underlying structural reality. I don't think it can be that Barack Obama and Donald Trump disagree on everything except for the fact that they love sanctions. So I think that sanctions will be used. I think that what we really need to guard against is misuse or abuse, as you say. And so I think we should only be using these tools when there's a clear rationale, when there's a vital national security interest at stake. And ideally, we should be doing them in concert with other allies, right? Because I think when we act alone, then we're incentivizing everybody to hedge against us. But when we're acting with Europe, with the UK, with Japan, with the issuers of the other major reserve currencies, there's not really anywhere else to go, right? It's not like that gold is a good substitute for the dollar, right? But I think if it's us acting alone, and as we've seen in the last few months, the euro is a pretty good substitute for the dollar.
Right.
So I think that is the real risk is misuse or abuse as opposed to overuse.
Yeah, I mean, what I hear you saying is that, people in positions of power like to exert power. And once they have a new set of tools, they're likely to use it to advance, strategic goals. And if you can use economic weapons, which in a sense don't have the political costs of going to war, then you're just very likely to do that, regardless of your political party. And I don't think it's a hard argument to make at this particular moment that the use of economic weapons is increasing. I mean, if America was not thinking deeply about economic weapons 6 months ago, they certainly are now. I mean, everyone in America is thinking about tariffs and specifically about China. And I have to say, your book looks almost prescient in highlighting the potential growth of these kinds of tools, given the Trump administration's approach to trade policy. Maybe before we get to the current tariffs. You talked a little bit about sanctions, but the book also covers export controls and the rise of export controls in the context of China, concerns over Chinese technology companies. Maybe talk to us a little bit about that history, and then we can talk about tariffs.
Yeah, sure. So one, I think, big theme of my book, and one that I think has made it resonate with many people, is this wasn't always a grand strategy, right? There's a lot of accidental discoveries that occur along the way. In fact, when we discover that the financial system can be used as this incredible choke point in the mid 2000s, George W. Bush, the president at the time, actually thought that there was nothing left to do on Iran sanctions. So we had basically sanctioned Iran to the hilt. There's nothing left we could accomplish. And it wasn't until this new official at the Treasury Department, Stuart Levy, who was running a new division of the department, realized that he basically could persuade banks around the world to shun Iran and basically could do this government to business direct diplomacy, didn't have to go to the UN or do any of the traditional diplomacy. I think the technology siege of China, or the export controls of China, was also something that we sort of stumbled into. In the very beginning of the Trump administration, one of the first things, actually, I think it was the very first act that Trump's Commerce Secretary in 2017, so this is the first Trump administration, Wilbur Ross did, was he signed this settlement with a Chinese telecommunications company called ZTE, the second largest telecommunications equipment maker in the country. And they'd violated Iran sanctions. And so they signed this settlement where they agreed to, censure a bunch of executives and pay $1 billion fine or something. And lo and behold, a year later, it turns out that ZTE had completely violated the terms of the settlement. They'd even promoted some of the executives that they said they were going to censure. And Wilbur Ross gets so pissed off that he imposes what's called a denial order on ZTE, which means that they're cut off effectively from all imports from the United States. And this is done again, just sort of like in the name of justice. There's not really a strategy attached to it. And yet, within a few weeks, ZTE makes this stunning announcement, which is that the operating activities of the company have ceased. That effectively, one of the biggest Chinese company was about to go out of business. And it was such a big deal that Xi Jinping makes an emergency call to Donald Trump and begs him to remove this denial order from ZTE.
Wow.
Which Trump agrees to do. ZTE pays another fine. They survive. But really, what happened was they were cut off from Qualcomm chips and other pieces of technology from Silicon Valley that they needed to produce their cell phones and switching equipment and other telecommunications gear. And so this was sort of this light bulb moment for the first Trump administration that they could weaponize American technology.
In other words, Wilbur Ross did not even necessarily foresee that the denial order would actually shut down the company.
No, I think it was a shock. And this was, like I said, it was a sort of an aha moment where we say, wow, there's this other choke point, not just Wall Street and the correspondent banks, but Silicon Valley and the tech companies. And then when tensions between the US and Huawei start heating up over the next year or two, this weapon is then reused against Huawei and expanded upon as in an effort basically to cut off Huawei from high-end US semiconductors, US-made design semiconductors. And the Biden administration comes in, takes those Huawei export controls and scales them to cover the entire Chinese economy. So in some ways, we mistakenly discover that this can be a weapon, this almost supply chain warfare. And then it has become really in many ways, the crux of our China strategy, which is we are explicitly trying to hinder China's technological development, particularly in frontier areas like artificial intelligence. Computing power and chips are the choke point that we're weaponizing. And, something we stumbled upon has now been really turned into, a key part of our strategy against our main geopolitical competitor.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up AI. I mean, obviously, part of what is motivating U.S. policymakers is this feeling that there's an existential risk around AI and supremacy in AI. And, folks in the tech sector have different views about this, both about, sort of whether we should be trying to, stop China, but also just, is it going to work? Can we actually meaningfully slow China? Can the U.S. on the other side, maintain its lead? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, are these kinds of strategies likely to help the U.S. maintain its sort of current edge in AI?
So I think that the technology export controls on China that originate in the first Trump administration really mark this sea change in how we think about economic warfare. And I think it helps illuminate a broader shift in thinking about how the global economy works. Because back when I was in government, in the earlier part of the 2010s, whenever we were imposing sanctions or export controls, be it on Iran or Russia, they were viewed as a means to an end, that we were imposing harm on Iran to try to persuade Iran to give up its nuclear program, after which Iran would be welcomed back into the global economy.
You're trying to force action of some kind.
Exactly. The unnatural state of affairs is sanctions or export controls, and the natural one is open and free trade and finance, right? With China, and particularly the technology-related export controls, starting with Trump and then carried through with Biden, there's no behavioralist calculus whatsoever. The idea is explicitly, as you rightly state, to slow China's technological progress. It is a manifestly zero-sum policy, one where we believe that in areas like artificial intelligence, in frontier technologies like quantum computing and biotech, like we want to stay as far ahead of China as possible. That was actually an explicit quote, direct quote by Jake Sullivan during the Biden administration. And so I think that, just think about it from a paradigm shift, right? We used to view our relationship with China economically as win-win. Now, in at least certain areas like technology, we view it as zero sum.
Right.
And I think that to me, that's why I am very confidently, and I said in my book, and I think fewer people would disagree with me now, that globalization is dead, right, as we know it. And that the ideology, the belief that undergirded it no longer really carries weight with anyone of consequence in the United States. So whether or not it will work, whether or not we'll meaningfully slow China, I have a hard time disagreeing with people like Dario Amodei, who says that, the export controls are critical and they are giving American companies a really important advantage over Chinese competitors. At the same time, I think what we saw in terms of the breakthroughs that DeepSeek has accomplished in the last 6 to 12 months, what that tells me is that there are many ingredients to what makes a really successful artificial intelligence algorithm, right? Part of it is chips. Part of it is the algorithmic innovation. Part of it is talent, data. And I think that having that advantage in computing power does give US companies an edge. But I think if we rely on that as our sole thing that's going to help us win the AI race with China, I think that's a fool's errand, right? Because if they're ahead of us in talent, in data, in algorithmic innovation, we're not going to win, especially when you're viewing it as part of a more fulsome geoeconomic competition. You also need things like industrial policy, like immigration policy, like scientific research funding. Those are also very important if you're really going to try to win against China.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that your book explores is the sort of unforeseen consequences of economic warfare, and of general foreign policy. And I'm sure it's something you saw firsthand in your own work in the State Department. I mean, one argument with respect to the export controls on semiconductors on China is that it just gives them more of a reason to invade Taiwan. And so, and not they may or they may not, but hard to know if it's ultimately going to work to our benefit.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that part of the appeal of economic warfare is that it's not kinetic, right? That it's an alternative to military force. And I think in addition to hyper-globalization in the 90s, kind of setting the table for the use of this novel form of American financial and technological warfare, there's this other political factor, which is Afghanistan and Iraq, right? Those two wars in the early part of the 21st century just kill political support across the spectrum in the US for the use of military force. And so economic warfare rises in American politics as sort of an alternative. And I think policymakers have come to view sanctions as something that they can use that doesn't necessarily risk war. But more often than not throughout history, really, economic warfare has been part of the same spectrum that also includes military force. And I think maybe infamously, the oil embargo and other commodities embargoes on Japan in the 1940s, many people credit with or discredit for precipitating Pearl Harbor. And so I do think we should be cognizant of unintended consequences. Certainly with respect to China, the export controls on chips have incentivized China to indigenize their semiconductor industry, right? Whereas right now, you've got HiSilicon, which is this national champion that's a subsidiary of Huawei that is, trying to do everything that US chip companies do. And you have companies in China now that are trying to build EV machines that are as good as ASMLs. And maybe they can't do it next year, but could they do it by 2030, 2035? I think most people think they will, so there are unintended consequences. It's also a diminishing resource. Once you start weaponizing a choke point, chances are alternatives will be built. But the other thing that's important to note is as certain choke points fade into irrelevance, other choke points rise into significance. And as new industries are built, and something that's very relevant for people like you in the technology space and innovation and venture capital, there will be new choke points that develop over time.
But that goes both ways. I mean, I've been struck, having read your book and then thinking about, one of China's reactions to Trump's tariffs being to cut off the supply of critical minerals to the U.S., where China has almost a total monopoly on certain, key minerals and both the sort of presence of them, but also the processes for mining them and refining them. It really cuts both ways.
100%. And look, I think when China was hit with the first onslaught of economic warfare by the Trump administration in 2018. This is both the ZTE export controls I mentioned earlier, plus the first wave of Section 301 tariffs that Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, pioneered in 2018. Beijing was totally unprepared, right? They were not expecting an economic war with the United States, right? This was such a paradigm shift in terms of the U.S. approach to China, which for decades had been all about bringing in China closer into the U.S. economic orbit. But that was, 7 years ago, right? And the Chinese leadership is the same, right? They've got Xi Jinping, he's still in charge. And so they've had a, concerted national strategy since 2018, both on the one hand to insulate themselves against American economic warfare, protecting themselves, but then also to develop their own economic arsenal. And I think one of the Trump's biggest misconceptions about the US-China dynamic is he thinks that because the US imports so much more from China than China imports from the US, basically we run a giant trade deficit with China, that we have the advantage, that we can always impose more tariffs on China than they can impose on us. And he actually has this quote from his first term where he says, trade wars are good and easy to win because you're running such a big deficit. But what Trump misses is that tariffs are just one weapon in the economic arsenal. And in fact, they're probably the weakest weapon. China has sanctions. They have export controls. These are legal authorities that they've passed in recent years that are now ready to use, and they've been deploying them. So you mentioned the export controls on critical minerals, right? In many of these mineral areas, China controls almost 100% of the market, right? They're processing almost 100% of this mineral that's going in to build batteries or going in to build ammunition for the U.S. Defense Department. China also has sanctions, right? They've imposed sanctions on Skydio, the biggest drone company in Silicon Valley, which has been forced to ration batteries to one per drone for each customer because they have lost access to their Chinese batteries.
Right.
They've imposed sanctions on Illumina, the DNA sequencer that some of your listeners may be familiar with. They've imposed sanctions on PVH, the giant apparel company. I spoke with folks there, and they're very nervous about what that'll mean for them. They've imposed sanctions on DuPont Chemical, right? There are a number of different US companies that are highly vulnerable to Chinese economic warfare. And so I think one of the biggest misnomers out there is that they're saying that this is a trade war between the US and China. No, it is a multi-domain economic war in which miscalculation is in some ways the biggest risk because we don't know exactly where that escalatory spiral could lead.
And one of the key points in your book is that what seems to be a small, subtle thing, the fact that people use JP Morgan to settle trades actually can have an enormous impact on global economy in the same way. If every battery requires a little bit of one mineral and China's all of that mineral, like, they've got all the power in that situation. And so one question I'm sure you've spent time thinking about is, what are the choke points that are maybe coming next that people have not quite figured out, or, someone in DC and in Beijing are thinking about right now, that we'll be exploiting next year?
Yeah, so I think the most obvious one, and one that's extremely, one of the reasons I've believed in what you're doing in Commonweal from the beginning, is the clean energy supply chain, right? I do think that whether we like it or not, we are moving into a new energy system, right? Fossil fuels will still play a part of them, but you are going to have more, batteries, wind, solar, et cetera. In all of these areas, China dominates, right? I mean, China controls soup to nuts in the clean energy supply chain. We mentioned critical minerals. Those are the minerals that are going into building batteries. Batteries themselves, China is the dominant producer, right? Even Tesla is reliant on their gigafactory in China, right? It's a part of the reason that Elon Musk, I think, has been not so keen on a big economic war with China, right? And then when you get to the finished electric vehicles themselves, I mean, China is by far the world leader, to the point that the Biden administration, not Trump, felt that it was necessary to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Because if we were to allow BYD EVs into the US market tariff-free, they would eat Tesla and GM's lunch. They're cheaper and better. And so this is an area where we are a decade behind. And so the question is, what do we do about it, right? One thing I think we certainly don't want to do is, have China cut us off right now, because that would be, existential to a lot of US companies. What we need to do, we need to have a strategy where we avoid escalation in the US-China economic war while simultaneously building our domestic resilience, investing in the supply chain we need, not just in the US, but with allies, so that we have an alternative to China. That's why I think some, policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act that were put forward in the Biden administration had bipartisan support. So I don't think they're, Democratic only policies are so important for this age of economic warfare. Because if we don't do them, if we don't invest in our vulnerabilities, we are going to be, susceptible to Chinese economic warfare.
You talked about the kind of shifts in globalization, or sort of the sentiment around globalization, and the tariffs as an overall regime seem to. I guess I don't understand what the ultimate policy goal is. I mean, the export controls, okay, fine. We don't want China to compete with us on AI. Like, I got it. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. But at least there's a sort of raison d'etre behind it. With tariffs, like, what do you view as the ultimate end goal of the Trump administration? What are they trying to achieve? Is it just to reduce U.S.-China entanglement? Is it to slow global trade? Is it just we're going to get a better deal and then we are going to go back to, more of a free trade regime?
Yeah. So look, Trump has loved tariffs since the 1980s. And so I say it's like, when I was in high school, I decided Radiohead was my favorite band. I'm now pushing 40 and Radiohead's still my favorite band. You fall in love with certain things at key moments in your life. It's always going to sound good to you. So look, there's no telling Trump that tariffs aren't good. Trump has had many different rationales, though, and they change over time, right? Sometimes he says we're going to use tariffs to raise government revenue, right? Because he wants to lower income taxes. Sometimes he says we want tariffs to insulate domestic industries from foreign competition and bring jobs back to the United States. Other times he've used tariffs as this sort of multi-purpose negotiating tool, right? Which is leverage against everyone, trying to cut trade deals with, 90 countries in 90 days, which I'm skeptical of. You can't do all of those at the same time, right? If you wanted to use tariffs to incentivize onshoring, you need companies to know that those tariffs are going to be in place for decades. Otherwise, they're just going to keep waiting and say, oh, well, it's so costly to move my supply chain out of China or out of Vietnam or out of Canada that I'm going to wait until I know for a fact that I have to do this, right? But if all at the same time they're negotiating leverage, you got to be ready to lift the tariff or lower the tariff rather when you get what you want from your adversary. So I don't think they have very clear goals. Would be my honest answer. I think that there are different people in the Trump administration who want different things. And by the way, I don't think that's unique to Trump. You and I served in a different administration. There are always people who support policies for different reasons, and there's factionalism. I think that factionalism within the Trump administration is more than we usually have, and Trump is less of a top-down leader than we normally see, less of a process-oriented leader. But I do think that's how I interpret it, and there are different factions that sort of rise and fall over time. One other point, though, I want to make about tariffs is that, we talked about choke points, right? If you view tariffs as a tool of economic warfare, what is the choke point, right? It's the U.S. consumer market. The U.S. is something like 13% of global imports, right? But it's not that high, right? Compare that to the dollar, right? The dollar, 60% of foreign exchange reserves, 90% of all foreign exchange transactions. Compare it to semiconductor supply chains, 40% of the value chain, right? So I worry that Trump exaggerates the leverage we have as an importer.
Yeah.
And also, generally speaking, when I think about trade, like, is it the importer or the exporter who has more leverage? It's the exporter, because ultimately the importer, is a source of money. The exporter might be the source of a good that's scarce, right? So, if the U.S.-China trade was to go from, $500, $600 billion to zero overnight, China would, have a significant demand shock, right? Where like they would lose a big market for their products, and the government would probably have to step in with big fiscal stimulus. For the U.S., we'd have a supply shock, and some of these goods, where 99% of the world supply is coming from China, we would have shortages and scarcity and massive inflation. And so I think the level of disruption we'd have in the U.S. would be significantly higher than the disruption China would experience.
Yeah, and here the kind of the metaphor of choke points, and you used the word siege earlier, which was powerful for me. I mean, a siege, you surround a city and you cut it off from everything. U.S. could tell the rest of the world we're not going to buy anything, and like they would keep trading with each other. They would keep selling stuff. I mean, maybe
Totally.
certainly some companies would be doing less well. Whereas to your point, like cutting off a certain kind of chip, or cutting off access to the global trading system through US banks is orders of magnitude more powerful, because we have so much more power in that market.
It's asymmetric, right? We have more power than others have, right? When it comes to trade, we're not the biggest trading player. Like if all we had were tariffs, right? If that was like the only weapon, tariffs and export controls, right? Sort of export restrictions and import restrictions, we would not be the 100-pound gorilla in the room, right? It would be China. They're the biggest trading power by far. I worry that Trump has a bit of a misunderstanding of where the real locus of American economic power lies, which is really in the financial system, first and foremost, and the technology system.
Yeah. Yeah. You're interesting in this conversation, not only because you have an academic lens and a practitioner lens, but you yourself have also worked in the technology sector and invested personally. Our audience are mostly folks who are day-to-day, running startups, where Trump's ultimate policy goals are maybe less important than, the ultimate impact on their business today. If you were a technology founder, how would you be thinking about the likely impacts of the tariffs, and what, more practical steps might you be taking to kind of plan?
Yeah, great question. Look, I think one question I often get from founders, from investors, is when are things going back to normal, right? And I understand that. Look, my formative years were the 90s and 2000s, right? Like I grew up thinking that globalization was like the ordinary state of things, right? My own view, and the thesis I put in my book, Chokepoints, is that we are living in an age of economic warfare. Like an age usually isn't like a 10-year period or 20-year period, right? I think this is going to play out over decades, right? And so I think that maybe the first thing to say is like, buckle up, like this is the new normal. And even if you are to have, Pete Buttigieg as president in 2029 or something like that, we're not going back to where we were 10 years ago. And so I think that would be point one. Point two is, what do you do about it, right? I think the difficulty we have right now is because Trump is weaponizing American economic power against everyone, right? Not just China and Russia and Iran, but the EU, Canada, Mexico. It's really hard to know like where's safe, right? Some people think India is a good place to go, maybe Japan. That seems right to me. But I think that what I would counsel more than a specific country is like build your geopolitical expertise. Bring in board members who understand geopolitics. Bring in team members who understand these things. So you can have an edge, right? That can be part of your competitive advantage, is being able to see things that others don't. And then point three, and there's something that I think that why I would encourage founders to talk to Commonweal, and you didn't ask me to say this, but it's true, is I think sometimes startups don't know how to communicate with government. And I think that it's really important to share your perspective. Big companies obviously have big lobbying operations. They've got law firms that are representing them in DC. They've got open dialogue with the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, state, the White House. Rarely when I was in government did I meet with, startups or, and part of that is a financial thing. But I think investing in that resource, having somebody who's in Washington, not necessarily lobbying, but just sharing your perspective and saying, look, this is how this is impacting my business. Don't underestimate that. There are human beings in the government who are making these policies, and they're not going to take into account your perspective if they don't know it. So I think that would be my third point.
It's powerful, and your point that this is the age of economic warfare. I mean, I'm not sure I've quite absorbed that yet, but this is not just a one-off. It's not an aberration. Maybe tariffs will look different in a year. Maybe they'll look different in 6 years. But like, we are living in an age where we are withdrawing from the sort of norm of free trade that governed the second half of the 20th century, and that just has impacts for every business in the United States, regardless of what you're doing. And you just need to start taking that more seriously and integrate it into your long-term planning. You have to think about it. You have to develop a reflex and muscle around it.
Right. And you can't rely on, my founder, the CEO likes reading The Economist or something. Like, I think you need somebody who, like, this is their job to, like, give your company a competitive advantage in this space.
And there's just not that sharp a line anymore between, if there ever was, between politics and economics. That's just
no. There's not. So this is actually, I mean, and I don't want to. I hope everyone reads Chokepoints, but I'll spoil a little bit of it for you. Which is, I mean, there is this macro narrative, which I think that's what cuts across the book, where we start at a period in the 90s where we think that the global economy is sort of this autonomous machine. It exists outside of politics. Government shouldn't be intervening in the economy. To one where today, like, government policy is reshaping the global economy before our very eyes. One way to look at sanctions, tariffs, export controls is they are literally the blueprints of a new global economy. With each one that goes into effect, a new line is drawn, right? And that line's not going to be erased. So, we may not have a Bretton Woods conference where, the leaders of the world come together and sketch out a new global economy by design. But this is what's happening, right? Like, and the edifice is being built before our very eyes, and the companies that'll succeed are the ones that are understanding what's happening and can kind of predict what comes next.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the thesis driving Commonweal that understanding political economy is helpful for running even an early stage technology startup. As we wrap up, I guess I was left with maybe a disquieting sense from the book. In part grounded in my own kind of reading of political philosophy. And I was brought back to Montesquieu, who, probably no one has currently read, but, is a very prominent 18th century political philosopher, a big impact on our founding fathers. And he talked about doux commerce, sweet commerce, that commerce brings people together, that it's a tie that binds. And it's hard not to look back at history. You mentioned some examples already where trade conflict often was a precedent to war or to, much more violent conflict. And so as I look at this current age, it's hard for me to feel like this is making the world more peaceful or more secure. And I'm curious how you reflect on that.
I agree. What I will say, though, is I think that we don't yet know how the age of economic warfare is going to develop and where it's going to go, ultimately where we're going to end up. I mentioned earlier that it can't just be that we got, bad luck and that Barack Obama and Trump disagree on everything, but they agree that, sanctions are great, right? There's a structural underpinning. And the way I would summarize it is that the world economy is still designed for the benign geopolitical environment of the 1990s, but we're living in an intensifying period of geopolitical competition, right? So the premise of the economy we have right now is that there wouldn't be geopolitical competition. The premise is that we would be living in peace, right? But we have very fierce geopolitical competition between the US and China and Russia and Europe and everyone, right? And so there's this fundamental mismatch that exists sort of at the heart of the global economy. My own view is that we are going to see some level of unraveling of economic interdependence in the next decade or two. I think there are really two paths, though. One path, and I think the one we were trending toward, honestly, during the Biden administration, was sort of a global economy divided into rival blocks, where you had a US bloc with closer economic ties with North America, with Europe, with democracies in Asia. Basically, this concept of friendshoring, right? Like closer relationships with allies and sort of more of a wall between our democracies and the China-led bloc and with the autocracies, right? By the way, I think that economy might be good, right? That might be better for us in that, we may still have the benefits of economic interdependence without the friction that relying on China for, pharmaceuticals leads in our lives, or China, the friction they feel by relying on the dollar, right? That makes them feel viscerally afraid, right? But I do think there's another world, and it's the one where we're not in a block-based global economy, but something that looks a little bit more like autarky. And most economists will tell you autarky is impossible, and I would agree. It's costly, but I think the consequence of the U.S. weaponizing its economic power against everyone, right? Viewing choke points as something that you can use basically to get a little bit more out of a deal with Japan or Canada or Colombia or any of these other countries that Trump has threatened with sanctions and tariffs. You're creating an incentive for everybody to hedge against the United States. And then again, putting yourself in the shoes of an American CEO, there's nowhere where these CEOs feel like they can locate their supply chains besides the US. And so I think there's a world where we sort of, whether it's intentional or unintentional, we sort of wind up backsliding into autarky. And my fear there, Nate, is the one you have, which is history shows that if states can't feel confident that they can acquire resources and markets through open trade and finance, they're tempted into things like imperialism and conquest, to planting the American flag on foreign lands. And that scares me, because I think that the biggest accomplishment in American statecraft in the 20th century was to move from sort of this age of great power war, World War I and World War II, to what we have today, where most of great power competition's happening in the economic domain instead of the military domain.
Well, on that sobering note, Eddie, thank you so much for joining us today. I encourage all of our listeners to go out and get a copy of Chokepoints. It's well worth the read. Congratulations on all of your success on that. Look forward to talking again soon.
Thanks, Nate. Really enjoyed the conversation.